Picture this. It's 1967, and a primer gray Plymouth Valiant with a Slant-Six. The engine nobody hot-rodded. Just embarrassed a pristine Chevelle with a 327 small block at a Van Nuys stoplight. 30 seconds later, the Chevelle driver is staring at taillights, wondering what the hell just happened. The secret was a modification so stupid simple that Chrysler's own engineers tested it, confirmed it added 45 horsepower, and then buried the results because admitting a guy with a hacksaw out-engineered their entire department was too embarrassing. The Slant-Six. Nobody wanted to hot row. Let me set the scene. 1960. Chrysler unveils the Slant-Six, and the engineering world collectively shrugs. It's a 225 cubic inch inline, 6 tilted 30 degrees to the right. Why? To fit under low hood lines while maintaining a long stroke. Clever packaging, sure, but nobody's writing songs about clever packaging. The specs were painfully ordinary. 145 horsepower in early versions. Maybe 170 if you were lucky. Single-barrel carburetor. Cast iron everything. 7.5 to 1 compression ratio. This wasn't a performance engine. This was a get-to-work engine. A delivery truck engine. A please start in Minnesota in January engine. But here's what Chrysler did right. Even if it was accidentally. They overbuilt the hell out of it. The block was thick enough to be a bunker. The crank had 7 main bearings when most Sixes had 4. The head bolts were placed perfectly to prevent warping. They designed it to last 300,000 miles in a taxi, not to win races. And it did exactly that. Slant-Sixes ran forever. Boring forever, but forever. The hot rod community looked at the Slant-Six and saw absolutely nothing. Why would you? In 1965, you could get a small block Chevy that made 300 horsepower in stock form. Ford had the 289. Chrysler themselves had the 318 and 343. If you wanted to go fast, you bought a V8. End of story. The Slant-Six ended up in every boring car Chrysler made. Plymouth Valiants, Dodge Darts, Dodge trucks, even some A-bodies. It was the engine your mom drove to the grocery store. It was what you got when you checked the base model box. Insurance companies loved it because you literally couldn't get in trouble with 145 horsepower. Teenage boys hated it for the same reason. Detroit's thinking was straightforward. Economy engines were economy engines. Performance engines were performance engines. Never the twain shall meet. They had entire product lines built around this separation. You want fast? Here's a 383 with a 4-barrel and dual exhaust. That'll be $3,000 more. You want cheap? Here's a Slant-Six. Don't call it slow, call it economical. The aftermarket completely ignored the Slant-Six. Edelbrock didn't make manifolds for it. Holley didn't have carburetor kits. Crane didn't grind cams. Why would they? The market was zero. Nobody who wanted to go fast bought a Slant-Six on purpose. It was like making performance parts for a lawnmower. Technically possible, completely pointless. There were a handful of weirdos, of course. There always are. Some guy in Des Moines who'd stroke a Slant-Six to 262 cubic inches, because why not? A farmer in Oklahoma who'd run one on moonshine and swore it made 20 extra horsepower. But these were curiosities, not a movement. The Slant-Six remained what Chrysler designed it to be. Reliable, economical, boring as church on a Tuesday. The engine had one fundamental problem that everyone accepted as unchangeable physics: the intake manifold. Due to that 30-degree slant and the need to clear accessories, Chrysler had routed the intake in a way that prioritized packaging over airflow. The path from carburetor to cylinders was tortuous. Fuel would puddle in low spots. Air would tumble and lose velocity. Chrysler's engineers knew this. They'd optimized it as much as packaging allowed. And then they'd moved on because, again, economy engine. Good enough was good enough. Except good enough wasn't good enough for one particular mechanic who refused to accept that a 7-main bearing inline 6 with perfect head bolt placement couldn't make real power. Enter Tom Hoover's nemesis. His name was Frank Swigert. Not a household name. Not even a hot rod magazine name. Frank ran a small speed shop in Gardena, California, mostly doing carburetor work and ignition tuning. He'd spent the 50s working on industrial engines, specifically stationary compressor engines for oil fields. Big, heavy, slow-revving things that had to run 24/7 without braking. Here's what made Frank different. He didn't think in terms of what engines were supposed to do. He thought in terms of fluid dynamics. Air was a fluid. Fuel was a fluid. Get them moving the right direction at the right velocity, and power happened. All the cultural baggage about economy versus performance engines didn't matter to Frank. Physics was physics. In 1965, a customer brought him a Valiant with a Slant-Six. The guy was a traveling salesman who drove 400 miles a day. He wanted better fuel economy, not more power, just better mileage. Frank started analyzing the engine, specifically the intake manifold, and something bothered him. The stock manifold brought air and fuel in from the right side of the engine, the slanted side. It then had to route everything up and over to reach the far cylinders. Frank pulled out his flow bench, something most speed shops didn't even have for six-cylinder engines, because why bother, and started measuring. The results were worse than he expected. The front and rear cylinders were getting 30% less airflow than the middle cylinders. Fuel distribution was even worse. Cylinders 1 and 6 were running lean, while 3 and 4 ran rich. The engine wasn't just inefficient, it was fighting itself. Frank knew that Chrysler's engineers weren't stupid. They designed the intake this way because of space constraints. The alternator, power steering pump, and air conditioning compressor all lived on that side of the engine. The intake had to fit around them. It was a packaging solution, not an airflow solution. But here's where Frank's industrial engine experience kicked in. On those stationary compressors, intake placement didn't matter for packaging because nothing was moving. So engineers optimized purely for airflow. And what Frank remembered was something counterintuitive. Sometimes longer intake runners with less velocity but better distribution outperformed shorter runners with higher velocity but poor distribution. He started sketching. What if you reversed the intake, brought it in from the left side, the non-slanted side? The cylinders were still inline, still parallel. The head had equal spacing. If you could route the intake to hit all 6 cylinders evenly, even if the path was longer, you might get better total airflow. Everyone Frank talked to said it was a bad idea. Longer runners meant less velocity. Less velocity meant less power. That was basic carburetor theory. Plus, where would you even mount a carburetor on the left side? There was no flat surface. The whole engine was tilted 30 degrees. You'd need a custom manifold, custom linkage, custom everything. Frank, being Frank, didn't care about custom. He cared about airflow. He grabbed a spare Slant-Six head and intake manifold from his junk pile and started measuring. And then he grabbed his hacksaw. Because sometimes the best engineering tool is a hacksaw, and a complete disregard for how things are supposed to work. The backwards intake. That shouldn't work. Here's what Frank did, and it's so simple you'll be angry Chrysler didn't do it from the factory. He took the stock intake manifold and literally flipped it over. Backwards. Upside down. Wrong. The stock manifold had the carburetor mounting surface on the right side, feeding runners that went left. Frank flipped it so the carburetor surface was on the left, and the runners went right. Except now the runners were upside down, which meant the floor was the ceiling, and vice versa. This is where it gets interesting. That 30-degree slant that made the original intake routing so tortured, when you flipped the manifold, that slant now worked in your favor. The runners naturally angled down toward each cylinder, instead of having to climb over each other. Gravity was helping instead of fighting, but you can't just flip a manifold and bolt it on. Frank had to make it work. First problem, The carburetor mounting surface was now slanted the wrong direction. Frank machined an aluminum adapter plate, 3 inches thick, that corrected the angle and gave him a flat surface for a standard 4-barrel Holly. This adapter also acted as a plenum, giving the air a chamber to equalize pressure before entering the runners. Second problem, the bolt holes were now on the wrong side. Frank drilled and tapped new mounting holes in the head. This sounds scary, but remember, this head had enough meat on it to handle taxi duty. A few extra threaded holes weren't going to crack anything. Third problem, the throttle linkage was now on the opposite side of the engine from the gas pedal. Frank fabricated a simple bell crank assembly from industrial shelf parts. Took him 2 hours. The whole modification cost about $40 in materials, a hacksaw, some aluminum plate, a Holly 4-barrel from the junk bin, and hardware store bolts. The most expensive part was his time, and Frank was doing this on nights and weekends anyway. Now here's the part that violates everything hot rodders thought they knew. The runner length increased by about 3 inches. Conventional wisdom said longer runners meant lower velocity, which meant less power. Every carb guy in California would have told Frank he was making the engine worse, but Frank had measured something interesting. With the reversed manifold, all 6 cylinders were now getting equal airflow. Not 30% variation, equal. And the plenum effect from that adapter plate was letting the air organize itself before entering the runners. The flow was laminar instead of turbulent. Plus, there was a Venturi effect happening that nobody had predicted. As air entered the adapter plate from the carburetor, it had to make a gentle 90-degree turn. This turn created a pressure differential that actually accelerated the air slightly. Not a lot, maybe 5%, but enough. Frank bolted the whole contraption onto that traveling salesman's Valiant and fired it up. The idle was rougher than stock because the plenum volume was different and the fuel distribution was still being sorted out. Frank rejetted the Holly, adjusted the timing, and took it for a test drive. The salesman had been getting 17 miles per gallon. After Frank's modification, 23. But more interesting was the power. The car felt stronger everywhere, not just at wide-open throttle, everywhere. Mid-range torque was up. Throttle response was sharper. The engine pulled cleanly to 5,000 RPM instead of falling flat at 4,000. Frank put the car on his chassis dyno, an old Clayton unit he'd picked up from a closed shop. The stock Slant-Six in that Valiant had made 117 horsepower at the wheels when the salesman bought it in. After the intake swap, 162. That's a 45 horsepower gain. From flipping the manifold backwards, the salesman was happy with the fuel economy and paid Frank his $50 labor charge. Frank was confused about the power gain and started building another one to make sure he hadn't screwed up the measurements. By the third one, he was certain. The backwards intake worked. Worked better than the engineers and Chrysler had managed with millions of dollars in development. And here's where the story should end with Frank becoming rich and famous. Except this is a story about how innovation gets buried, not celebrated. Because Frank was about to discover that having the better idea and getting anyone to care about it are two completely different things. When Slant-Sixes started embarrassing V8s. Word spread the way word always spreads in car culture. Somebody knew somebody who'd seen that Valiant run. By late '66, Frank had built a dozen of these backwards intake Slant-Sixes. The cars weren't purpose-built race machines. They were daily drivers, work trucks, grandma specials that happened to have one weird modification under the hood. The street racing scene in the San Fernando Valley was brutal in the '60s. Guys with serious money were running big block Chevelles and GTOs. These were 400-cube monsters making 400 horsepower. The betting was serious, the competition was fierce, and then someone showed up with a Valiant. Nobody took it seriously at first. A Valiant was what your mom drove. It was embarrassing to even line up next to one, but the car kept winning. Not by huge margins, not by blowing doors off, but winning. The Valiant would launch cleanly, shift smoothly, and be a car length ahead at the 8th mile. Against small blocks. Against 327s and 302s. The really embarrassing part? Gas mileage. These V8 guys were getting 10 miles per gallon if they were lucky. The Slant-Six cars were getting 23. You could race on Friday night and still afford to drive to work on Monday. The economics were devastating to the small block crowd. One particular incident became legendary. A guy named Bobby Ortiz had a pristine 65 Chevelle with a 327, 4-speed, and 373 gears. Beautiful car, probably 15 grand invested. He'd been undefeated for 6 months on Roscoe Boulevard. Then a Dodge Dart with one of Frank's intakes showed up. Bobby thought it was a joke. He actually laughed when the Dart pulled up. The car was beat to hell, primer gray, mismatched tires, but the driver wanted to race, so Bobby figured he'd take the guy's money and get dinner. $50 a race. They lined up. The flag dropped. The Dart's Slant-Six spun the tires for maybe 5 feet, hooked up, and just pulled. Smooth, linear power. Bobby's Chevelle had more peak horsepower, sure, but the power curve was all top end. Down low, where street races are won, the Slant-Six with Frank's intake was making more torque than the 327. Bobby lost by 2 car lengths. He demanded a rematch. Lost again. He accused the Dart driver of running nitrous. The driver, who was actually Frank himself testing his own work, popped the hood. Stock Slant-Six. No nitrous, no supercharger, just a weird-looking intake manifold that appeared to be installed backwards. Bobby ended up in Frank's shop the next week, wanting the same setup for his Chevelle. Frank had to explain that no, you can't do this to a small block Chevy. The Chevy intake was already optimized. This trick only worked on Slant-Sixes because Chrysler had prioritized packaging over airflow. Other guys who'd lost to Slant-Sixes started showing up. Some wanted the modification for their own Slant-Six cars. Others wanted to know what the hell they just raced. Frank started building more. He charged $100 for the conversion, which included the fabrication work, jetting, and tuning. He could build about 2 per week working evenings. By '67, there were maybe 50 cars running around Southern California with Frank's intake. Most were total sleepers. Nobody modified the exterior. Nobody added stripes or hood scoops. The whole point was to look stock and surprise people. The Slant-Six Underground wasn't about showing off. It was about knowing something nobody else knew. The racing continued. Small block guys started refusing to race Valiants and Darts on principle. It was too embarrassing to lose to a 6-cylinder. The few V8 guys who did race them often lost, got angry, and then got curious. A handful actually bought Slant-Six cars just to try Frank's intake. And through all of this, Chrysler never said a word publicly. But they were paying attention. Oh yes, they were paying very close attention. Chrysler knew and did nothing. This is the part of the story that makes you want to throw things. In early '67, a Chrysler engineer named David Potter walked into Frank's shop. Potter worked in the advanced engineering group at Chrysler's Highland Park facility. He'd heard rumors about the backwards intake Slant-Sixes and wanted to see one for himself. Frank showed him everything. The flipped manifold, the adapter plate, the Venturi effect, the equal flow distribution. Potter took notes, took measurements, took photos. He was impressed. He told Frank this was exactly the kind of grassroots innovation Chrysler wanted to know about. Potter went back to Highland Park and built 3 test engines with Frank's intake configuration. They put them on proper flow benches and dynamometers. The results confirmed everything Frank had claimed. 40 to 50 horsepower gains depending on the carburetor setup, better fuel distribution, better throttle response, and most importantly, it all came from better basic airflow dynamics, not increased displacement or compression. Potter wrote a formal report recommending that Chrysler either license Frank's design or develop their own version of the reversed intake for production. The report went to his supervisor, and then it disappeared. Here's what happened behind closed doors, according to later interviews Potter gave in the 80s. The engineering management saw Potter's report and panicked. If a guy in a garage with a hacksaw could improve the Slant-Six by 40 horsepower, what did that say about Chrysler's engineering department? They'd had hundreds of engineers and millions in development budget. Frank had a hacksaw. The official response was that the modification would be too expensive to implement in production. They'd have to redesign the intake casting, retool the foundry, update the assembly line procedures. All true, but the real objection was simpler: pride. If Chrysler released a modified Slant-Six that made 40 more horsepower, every automotive journalist would ask why the original engine hadn't been designed that way. Chrysler would have to admit they'd screwed up the intake packaging. They'd have to admit that prioritizing accessory placement over airflow had been wrong. They'd have to admit that an outsider had out-engineered them. So the report got filed away. Potter was told to focus on other projects. Frank never heard from Chrysler again. The backwards intake remained a garage modification, not a factory option. What makes this even more frustrating is that Chrysler continued building the Slant-Six with the flawed intake until 1983. 17 more years. They built millions of engines with an intake design they knew was suboptimal. They had the solution sitting in a file cabinet, tested and verified, and chose not to use it. This is corporate America in a nutshell. The not invented here syndrome taken to an absurd extreme. Better to keep making an inferior product than to admit someone outside the company had a better idea. Better to preserve the engineers' egos than to improve the product. Frank, to his credit, didn't seem bitter about it. He kept building his intakes for customers who wanted them. He made a decent side income. And he had the satisfaction of knowing he'd outsmarted Chrysler's entire engineering department with $40 in materials. The secret spreads through the late 60s and into the 70s. Frank's backwards intake became an underground legend. He couldn't build them fast enough. But here's where it gets interesting. Other mechanics started figuring out their own versions. Remember, Frank never patented his design. Couldn't patent it, really. You can't patent flipping something over. So the idea was essentially public domain. Any mechanic who'd seen one of Frank's intakes could copy it. Regional variations started appearing. A guy in Phoenix named Martinez developed a version using a truck intake manifold that had slightly longer runners. Claimed it made even more torque than Frank's version. In Detroit, ironically, a mechanic named Douglas Crawford built a version specifically for drag racing that used a 6-barrel carburetor setup. 3 2-barrels on a custom manifold feeding Frank's reversed runner design. That thing made 220 horsepower from a naturally aspirated Slant-Six. The East Coast got into it around '69. A shop in New Jersey started building what they called the Jersey Special. They'd take Frank's basic concept, but add port matching, polishing, and careful carburetor selection. These were the high-end builds, costing $500 instead of $100. They claimed 200 horsepower was achievable with the right combination of parts. Documentation was sparse. This was pre-internet, obviously. Information spread through car shows, drag strips, and word of mouth. A few articles appeared in smaller hot rod magazines, the ones that didn't have Detroit advertising dollars to protect. One article in Speed and Custom magazine from 1970 laid out the basic concept. That article probably introduced the modification to 10,000 more people, but mainstream hot rod media ignored it. Hot Rod magazine never covered it. Carcraft never mentioned it. These magazines relied on advertising from the major performance parts manufacturers, and none of those manufacturers made Slant-Six parts. Writing about Slant-Six performance would have been, in their minds, wasting magazine space that could promote products their advertisers actually sold. The modification remained underground. You had to know someone who knew someone. It was insider knowledge, passed around like a secret handshake. And honestly, that made it cooler. The guys running these cars weren't doing it for recognition. They were doing it because they knew something the establishment didn't. The military got interested around '71. Some Marine base mechanics in California had heard about the modification and tried it on Dodge trucks. The trucks had Slant-Sixes for reliability. The modified intakes gave them better power without sacrificing that reliability. Unofficial testing showed improved performance, and the modifications started spreading through military motor pools. By '75, there were probably 500 to 1,000 cars running some version of the backwards intake, concentrated in California, spreading to the southwest and eventually hitting the East Coast. These weren't organized clubs or formal groups, just individual hot rodders who'd heard about a trick that actually worked. Frank estimated he'd personally built about 200 intakes by the time he retired in '78. Other mechanics had built who knows how many more. Each one proved the same thing. The Slant-Six was never the problem. The intake manifold was. Fix the intake, and suddenly you had an engine that could embarrass small blocks. All of this happened while Chrysler continued selling millions of Slant-Sixes, with the factory intake that they knew was flawed. The irony was thick enough to cut with a hacksaw. Why it actually worked. Let's talk physics, because this is where it gets genuinely fascinating. Why did reversing the intake manifold work so much better? The stock Slant-Six intake had a fundamental problem. The carburetor sat on the right side of the engine, the slanted side. To reach all 6 cylinders, the intake runners had to snake upward and across. This created several issues. First, unequal runner length. Cylinders closest to the carburetor got short, direct paths. Cylinders farthest away got long, twisted paths. In a perfect world, every cylinder would have exactly the same runner length. The stock Slant-Six was far from perfect. Second, fuel puddling. As the air-fuel mixture traveled through those twisted runners, heavier fuel droplets would separate from the air and pool in low spots. This meant some cylinders ran rich while others ran lean. You'd jet the carburetor for the lean cylinders, and the rich cylinders would foul plugs. Or you'd jet for the rich cylinders, and the lean cylinders would detonate. No winning. Third, tumbling air. Good intake design keeps air moving smoothly. Laminar flow is the goal. The stock Slant-Six intake forced air through right-angle turns and over obstacles. This created turbulence. Turbulent air carries less oxygen per volume than laminar air. Less oxygen means less power. Frank's backwards intake solved all 3 problems. By flipping the manifold and coming in from the left side, he created nearly equal runner lengths. The difference between the shortest and longest runner was maybe ½ an inch instead of 3 inches. This meant all cylinders were breathing the same. The adapter plate plenum gave the air-fuel mixture a place to calm down and organize itself. Think of it like a highway with a rest area. Cars can spread out, merge properly, and then continue smoothly. The stock intake was like merging onto a highway at full speed with no acceleration lane. The reversed runner orientation put the natural slant of the engine to work. Instead of runners fighting gravity, they worked with it. Fuel droplets would naturally flow downward into the cylinders, instead of pooling in the manifold. This improved atomization and made for cleaner combustion. The gentle 90-degree turn in the adapter plate created a Venturi effect. As air accelerated through the turn, pressure dropped slightly. This pressure drop helped pull more air through the carburetor throat. It was a self-reinforcing cycle. More air meant more velocity meant more air. Modern computational fluid dynamics software would later confirm Frank's design was nearly optimal. He'd created something through trial and error that engineers with computers would spend weeks designing, and he'd done it with a hacksaw, a flow bench, and an understanding that air was just a fluid that wanted to flow smoothly. Sometimes the best engineering is just removing the obstacles you put in place originally. The legacy of a stupid simple hack. The backwards Slant-Six intake represents something bigger than just a clever modification. It's a story about how innovation actually happens versus how corporations think it happens. Chrysler's engineers weren't idiots. They knew the stock intake was compromised, but they were working within constraints. Packaging constraints, cost constraints, manufacturing constraints. They optimized within their box and moved on. Frank didn't have a box. He just had a problem and a willingness to try stupid things. This is the advantage outsiders always have. They don't know what's impossible. They don't have corporate politics to navigate. They don't have to justify every decision to a committee. They can just try stuff and see what happens. Sometimes, most of the time, the stuff doesn't work. But occasionally, you flip an intake manifold backwards and discover you've been doing it wrong for 7 years. The modification never became mainstream. Chrysler never adopted it. The major parts manufacturers never sold kits. But it influenced a generation of shade tree mechanics who realized that factory engineering wasn't gospel, that sometimes the simplest solution was the best solution, that a hacksaw and some common sense could beat $1 million R&D department. Today, the backwards Slant-Six intake is experiencing a revival. The Slant-Six itself is trendy again among a certain subset of hot rodders who value oddball engineering and underdog stories. People are building these engines, making real power, and posting videos that get millions of views. The information that was underground in the 60s is now freely available online. You can buy reproduction intakes now, CNC machined from aluminum, that incorporate Frank's reversed runner concept. They're expensive, like $800 expensive, but they work. Modern engine management systems make the jetting and tuning easier. Guys are building Slant-Sixes making 300 horsepower reliably. Frank Swigert passed away in 2003. He never became famous, never made serious money from his invention, but his stupid simple hack lives on. Every time someone flips an intake manifold and discovers it works better, they're following Frank's footsteps. Every time an outsider solves a problem the establishment said was unsolvable, that's Frank's legacy. The backwards intake proves something fundamental. Engineering isn't about credentials or budgets or sophisticated tools. It's about understanding how things actually work and having the guts to try something different. Sometimes the best ideas come from the guys who don't know enough to know it won't work. So here's to Frank Swigert and his backwards intake. Here's to every mechanic who's ever looked at factory engineering and thought, I can do better than that. Here's to the guys who proved that genius plus garage beats billions plus bureaucracy. The Slant-Six was never the problem. The intake was. And one mechanic with a hacksaw and a complete disregard for conventional wisdom proved it. That Valiant that embarrassed small blocks on Roscoe Boulevard wasn't running magic. It was running physics. Sometimes that's the same thing.